Does first-time sex always hurt? The truth revealed. They told you it would hurt. Whispered warnings passed between friends. Guarded conversations with anxious mothers. Outdated textbooks. Taboo jokes. Awkward silences. From every corner, one message. Your first time will be painful. Your body will tear. Your innocence will vanish. You'll be changed forever. And maybe you believed it. Maybe you prepared yourself to endure it. Clenched your jaw, braced your muscles, convinced yourself that pain was part of the process, that pain was proof. But what if it wasn't? What if everything you were told about that moment, about your body, about what it means, was built on myths? What if the real pain doesn't begin in the bedroom, but in the stories we've been fed for generations? What if the deepest wound comes not from the act itself, but from the weight of expectations? We rarely speak openly about first-time sex. We whisper around it. We treat it like a ceremony shrouded in shame. And in that silence, confusion breeds. Misinformation spreads. Fear grows. We've taught people to see sex through the lens of guilt, secrecy, and fear. And instead of creating space for trust, curiosity, and communication, we've built walls of awkwardness around something profoundly human. They told you it would hurt, but they never told you why. They didn't explain that your body tightens when you're anxious, that fear can cause tension, that pain is not a requirement, but a possibility, and often a preventable one. They didn't tell you that mutual care, slowness, safety, and comfort, these things matter more than any technical act. They told you pain was natural, expected, even noble, as if discomfort were some rite of passage you had to survive in order to be taken seriously as a sexual being. But the truth is, when you enter an experience expecting pain, you prepare for it. You tense up, your body resists, your mind spirals. And in that state, of course it hurts. And yet, pain becomes the script. It becomes the narrative passed from one generation to the next, mothers to daughters, peers to peers, culture to society. And so we keep repeating the same line, that first-time sex always hurts. But pain isn't proof of anything. It's not proof that you did it right. It's not proof of virginity. It's not proof of worth. And it's not just women who suffer from this narrative. Men too, told they must perform, that they must take the lead, that they should know instinctively how to handle such a delicate, emotional, physical moment. But no one ever taught them how to be gentle, how to ask, how to listen, how to understand readiness. So both people walk in blind, burdened with expectations, heavy with shame, unprepared for what should be a soft, intentional, and respectful act. Instead of preparing minds, we police bodies. Instead of offering understanding, we offer silence. Instead of encouraging questions, we enforce rules. And so we've created a culture where first-time sex is rarely about connection. It's about survival. Think about that. We've made something intimate feel like something dangerous. We've turned tenderness into tension. And in doing so, we've robbed so many of a gentle beginning. Sex should not be something you survive. It should be something you choose, freely, with care, with trust. Not because you're expected to, not because you're trying to keep someone, not because your friends already have, but because you want to, because you feel ready, because you are emotionally safe and physically informed. But that kind of decision is only possible when truth replaces myth, when education replaces shame, when openness replaces fear. Because here's what they never told you. First-time sex doesn't have to hurt. And if it does, it doesn't mean you're broken. It doesn't mean you're less than. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It simply means we need to do better. Better in how we educate. Better in how we speak. Better in how we prepare the next generation to love themselves and each other. Because silence breeds confusion. Confusion breeds shame, and shame breeds harm. It's time to unlearn the lies. It's time to rewrite the story. It's time to finally answer the question with clarity, care, and honesty. Not with fear, not with myths, not with blood-stained metaphors, but with truth. Let's begin. 1. The myth of inevitable pain. They say the first time always hurts, that it's something to fear, something to endure. That pain is the price you pay for crossing an invisible line, one you can never go back from. Maybe you heard it in whispers from older friends, in awkward warnings from parents, or in stories passed between girls behind bathroom doors. Maybe no one told you directly, but the message still reached you. through films, through silence, through the tightness in your own chest when the topic came up. Prepare yourself. It's going to hurt. That's just the way it is. But what if everything you've been told about pain, about purity, about the way your body is supposed to behave was wrong? Not just slightly wrong, but completely manufactured? A myth passed down not for your protection, but for your control? The belief that first-time sex must hurt didn't come from science or empathy. It came from a much darker place, one rooted in history, patriarchy, and fear. Centuries ago, a woman's value was measured not by her voice or mind or spirit, but by her chastity. Her untouched status wasn't personal, it was transactional. Virginity became a social currency. Entire families rested their honor on a girl's purity. Her first sexual experience wasn't about her body or her readiness. It was about proving that she had never belonged to anyone else. And how did they prove it? Blood, pain, suffering. These became the signs of virtue. And so, across cultures and generations, a myth was born. That the first time must hurt, that it's supposed to, and that if it doesn't, something's wrong. That if she doesn't bleed, she isn't really a virgin. That if she feels pleasure, she should feel shame. That pain is the marker of innocence lost. But this myth isn't just outdated. It's dangerous. It teaches young women to expect discomfort, to brace for trauma, to believe that their body is something that must be torn open for someone else's validation. It teaches them that pain is the price of worth, that pleasure is suspicious, that they are less valuable if their first experience isn't painful. And men, they're taught something just as harmful, that they're supposed to push through, that they should expect resistance, that taking virginity is an act of conquest, not connection, that pain is part of the script. And so they move forward, often unaware, confused, unsure, but driven by a narrative that leaves no room for softness, for hesitation, or for communication. So when two people meet at that moment, often young, often unprepared, they carry all that baggage with them. One is bracing for pain. The other is expected to lead. And neither has been taught how to speak, how to pause, how to listen. The result? Pain becomes real, not because it was inevitable, but because it was scripted. And then there's the hymen, the small ring of tissue that has been treated like a seal of virtue for centuries. Entire cultures have worshipped this piece of anatomy. But the truth? The hymen is not a barrier. It's not a wall. It's not something that must be broken or popped. It's a flexible membrane that varies from person to person. Some are born with almost no hymen at all. Others experience gradual stretching over time through sports, tampons, dance, or even nothing at all. And most importantly, bleeding is not guaranteed. Pain is not proof. The hymen doesn't define virginity. In fact, science tells us that virginity isn't even a medical concept. It's a social construct, a word we use to categorize people based on what they've done or haven't done. And more often than not, it's used to shame rather than understand. But despite the science, despite the facts, the myth lives on. It's passed down through generations like a superstition we're too afraid to question. It's woven into wedding nights, purity rings, religious teachings, and schoolyard rumors. It's reinforced every time a film shows a woman wincing in pain. Every time a story glorifies the moment as something to be taken or endured rather than shared. The real tragedy isn't that this myth exists, it's that it still thrives. It leaves people unprepared and ashamed. It turns what should be a mutual and thoughtful experience into one of fear and silence. And for many, that fear lingers long after the first time is over. It changes the way they view their own bodies, their sense of safety, their ability to say yes or no with confidence. The myth of inevitable pain teaches us that sex is something you survive, not something you choose. That the first time is meant to break you, not open you. And in doing so, it plants a lie so deep in the body that even years later, people are still trying to unlearn it, still wondering what was wrong with them, still carrying guilt, confusion, and distrust. But it doesn't have to be that way. Imagine if we taught something different, if we told the truth, that first-time sex, like any new experience, can come with nerves, but it doesn't have to come with pain. That with communication, consent, preparation, and care, the body knows how to soften. That pleasure is not a sin. That readiness is not a moment, it's a feeling. And that no one, not culture, not tradition, not religion, gets to define what your first experience should look like. Imagine if we stopped telling girls to expect blood and started telling them to expect respect. If we stopped telling boys to perform and started teaching them to listen. If we dismantled the myth piece by piece, until no one has to walk into intimacy carrying someone else's fear. The myth of inevitable pain has lasted for centuries, but it ends the moment we choose to speak. The moment we choose to tell the truth. Not with shame, not with silence, but with bold, compassionate honesty. Because your first time doesn't belong to anyone else, and it doesn't need to hurt to be real. Where the idea came from. They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes history is whispered, passed not through books, but through quiet glances, unspoken rules, and lessons that never had to be taught aloud. The idea that first-time sex must hurt is one of those whispers. It didn't start with love. It didn't come from truth. It was born from control. Centuries ago, a woman's body wasn't seen as her own. It was an extension of her father's house, a vessel for family honor, a bargaining chip in marriage, an asset to be transferred, not explored. Her virginity, as it was called, was a status symbol. Not a personal milestone, not a choice, not a chapter in her story, but proof of untouched property. And the more tightly it was guarded, the more value it held. This value wasn't based on biology, it was based on belief. The belief that pain proved purity, that suffering made it real. That blood on white sheets meant she had never belonged to another. In medieval Europe, some newlyweds were expected to produce blood-stained linen the morning after their wedding night, as evidence of the bride's chastity. No stain, no proof. No proof, no honor, and in some cases, no marriage. The consequences were brutal. A woman who didn't bleed could be accused of deceit, of sin, of disgrace. She could be shamed, beaten, returned, disowned, all because her body didn't behave according to the myth someone else created. Never mind the fact that not all women bleed the first time. Never mind that the hymen is different for every body. Science didn't matter, because fear had already written the rules. And it wasn't just Europe. Across the world, in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and beyond, similar myths took root. They weren't just about pain, they were about power. In some societies, virginity tests were, and still are, conducted to confirm whether a woman is intact. These tests are not only invasive, they are scientifically meaningless, and yet they persist. Because the myth is more powerful than the truth when the myth serves control. Religious institutions played their part too. In many doctrines, sex outside of marriage is labeled sinful. Desire itself becomes a warning sign, and so the body becomes an enemy, pleasure becomes a threat, and pain becomes a purifier. First-time sex in these narratives is framed not as a moment of connection, but as a boundary between the sacred and the damned. And so the myth grew. Like a shadow, it slipped into every corner of culture. It embedded itself in traditions, in rituals, in the way girls were raised to sit quietly, to guard themselves, to treat their bodies like delicate glass. Because one crack, real or imagined, meant everything changed. One act could stain a family name. And the only way to prove it had happened? Pain, blood, evidence. Over time, this expectation became so normalized that no one questioned it. It became folklore. It became fact. Even as medicine advanced, even as voices began to rise against it, the core belief held firm. First-time sex must hurt. Not because it always does, but because it always did. When it was forced, when it was rushed, when it was taken. And here's the cruel twist. Many of the first sexual experiences throughout history weren't consensual. Women were often given away as brides with no understanding of their own anatomy, no control over their partner, no say in the act. Pain was common not because of biology, but because of imbalance, because of silence, because they had no power to say no or to prepare. This myth became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Women were told it would hurt, so they tensed up, they braced themselves. And when their bodies resisted, the pain came. And instead of questioning the system, they blamed themselves. They believed it was normal, that it was supposed to happen like that. And they passed that belief on, mother to daughter, sister to sister, friend to friend, generation to generation. But the truth was buried underneath centuries of shame. The truth, that pain is not proof, that blood is not a badge, that a body is not something to be broken into, but something to be respected. What's even more devastating is how deeply this myth has been woven into love itself. In many stories, films, books, television, the first time is shown as awkward, painful, even tearful, but it's framed as romantic, as necessary, as meaningful because it hurts, as if suffering is what makes it sacred, as if emotional closeness must come at the cost of physical comfort. This narrative is poison, and it teaches people, especially young women, that their pain is noble, that discomfort is a sacrifice they must offer, that their body should be given, not celebrated, that pleasure is a reward they must earn later, after the hurt. So where did the idea come from? It came from fear, from patriarchy, from the desire to monitor, manage, and control women's bodies. It came from systems that saw women not as people, but as property. And it has survived not because it's true, but because no one dared to challenge it loudly enough. Until now. Because we have science now. We have stories. We have women and men speaking truth, unlearning shame, and rewriting what intimacy means. And it starts by pulling the myth up from the root, by understanding where it came from, and refusing to let it shape another generation's body, mind, or heart. The myth of inevitable pain was never meant to protect anyone. It was meant to keep people quiet. But silence has done enough damage. And now, finally, we speak. Let me know when you're ready for part 1.2, why it became normalized in the same 900-word voiceover style. Why it became normalized. It didn't start as a truth. It started as a whisper, a hush in the room when the topic came up, a glance between elders, a folded silence in sex education classes, an inherited fear dressed up as wisdom. The idea that first-time sex must hurt wasn't born from biology, but it survived like biology, embedded, unchallenged, passed from generation to generation like it was in our DNA. It became normal not because it was true, but because no one told us it wasn't. There was no open conversation, no guidebook that said, here's what's real, and here's what's myth. So the myth grew roots. It settled into bedrooms and textbooks, into movies and marriages. It slipped into our minds long before we were old enough to understand what it was planting. The first time will hurt. That was the story. And because everyone kept repeating it, no one dared to ask why. No one stopped to ask, what if it doesn't? What if pain isn't a law, but a consequence of something else, of fear, of misinformation, of silence? But silence is powerful. It's more dangerous than a lie, because it lets the lie breathe. It makes you feel like the discomfort is your fault, like your confusion is a personal flaw. And so, the moment you feel pain, you think, this is how it's supposed to be. Not because you understand it, but because that's all you've ever been told. And here's the irony. When something painful becomes expected, it stops being questioned. It becomes ritual. It becomes tradition. It becomes culture. It becomes normal. We watched it happen everywhere. In classrooms where sex was reduced to warnings and charts, where the mechanics were taught, but the emotions were ignored, where just wait was the only guidance offered, and you'll understand when you're older was the excuse for withholding truth. Instead of arming people with knowledge, we armed them with fear. And fear makes the body resist. Fear tightens muscles. Fear prevents trust. Fear turns curiosity into shame. And shame doesn't sit quietly, it grows. This fear-based framework was repeated not just by people, but by media. Watch any romantic drama. How is the first time portrayed? A dimly lit room, a nervous girl, a boy who doesn't quite know what he's doing, a wince, a gasp, then blood, tension, and finally, relief. And what does the story tell you? That this pain was beautiful, that it was part of the journey, that now she's crossed the line into womanhood. But that's not education. That's indoctrination. Movies made it look poetic. Music made it sound passionate. Culture wrapped it in metaphors, popping the cherry, losing it, giving it up. Even the language taught us that something had to be taken, that there was a cost, that the body was a door and someone else held the key. And this myth didn't just live in women's stories, it affected men too. Boys were taught that pain was expected, so hesitation was ignored. They were told to push through awkwardness, to make it happen. that the first time is supposed to be fast, clumsy, and over before it really begins. They weren't taught how to read a partner's body, how to ask the right questions, how to slow down, breathe, wait. They were trained to perform, not to connect. So they enter intimacy unprepared too, armed with pressure instead of patience. And because no one talks about it, both walk away confused. One feels shame for hurting, the other feels shame for not knowing, and both believe the myth that pain was part of the plan, that this is what everyone goes through, that if you didn't feel pain, you're the exception. This is how it spreads, not as a loud lie, but as a quiet rule. Not through force, but through neglect, through what's left unsaid. And when no one says otherwise, the myth evolves into a law. It becomes something you pass down, even if you don't mean to. A mother says, it'll hurt, but that's normal. A sister whispers, just get through it. A friend warns, it's supposed to be uncomfortable. And none of them are trying to scare you. They think they're helping, because that's what they were told, and they weren't given anything better. So pain becomes a legacy, one we don't even realize we're carrying, until we look back and ask, why did no one tell me the truth? But it's not too late. It's never too late to unlearn, to stop the story, to start a new one. The truth is, pain should never be the default. Discomfort is not a rite of passage. Bleeding is not proof. And shame has no place in intimacy. First-time sex doesn't need to hurt. And when it does, it's usually because someone wasn't ready. Because the moment was rushed. Because consent wasn't clear. Because no one knew how to talk about it. The myth was normalized through silence. But truth breaks silence. And once truth is spoken, it doesn't go back in the box. We have the chance now to say what wasn't said before, to give people knowledge instead of warnings, to teach readiness instead of fear, to replace myths with clarity, to make sure no one else confuses trauma with tradition, because when pain becomes the norm, no one seeks comfort, but when truth becomes the norm, healing begins. A hymen myth debunked. They told you the hymen was a seal, a thin sacred veil that tears the moment you have sex. They said it would break, that it should bleed, that it was proof of purity, of virginity, of morality. They said, if there's no blood, something's wrong. If it doesn't hurt, you must have done something before. If the hymen is gone, so is your worth. But let's stop for a moment, pause, breathe, and ask the question no one dared to ask before. What is the hymen really? Because biology never lied to us, people did. The hymen is not a wall, it's not a seal. It's not a fragile curtain waiting to be pierced. It's a stretchy ring of mucosal tissue, like a soft collar, located just inside the vaginal opening. It can vary in shape, size, and elasticity. Some hymens are barely noticeable. Some have small openings. Some are so stretchy that they never tear at all, even during penetrative sex. And others? They might wear away over time without any sexual activity whatsoever. This tissue isn't designed to break. It's designed to bend, to stretch, to evolve. And despite what generations have been told, the hymen is not a biological indicator of virginity. In fact, virginity isn't a medical concept at all. It's a social one. A label made up by people, not proven by science. Yet entire cultures still treat it like law. There are girls across the world today, right now, who are forced to prove their virginity, who are taken to doctors and subjected to invasive two-finger tests. Tests that claim to check whether the hymen is intact. But doctors, scientists, and the World Health Organization agree. These tests are meaningless. They cannot determine if a person has had sex. They cannot measure worth. They only cause trauma, shame, violation. And still, the myth continues. Still, young women panic when they don't bleed the first time. Still, they wonder if something is wrong with them. Still, they feel guilt for enjoying their experience instead of wincing through it. But bleeding isn't proof of virginity. It never was. And for the record, nearly 50% of women don't bleed during their first experience. Some bleed lightly, some not at all. And both are completely, entirely normal. So where did this obsession come from? Why did bleeding become the proof of purity? The answer isn't medical, it's historical, cultural, patriarchal. In many ancient societies, women were considered property, transferred from their fathers to their husbands. And like any commodity, she had to be untouched. And the only way men believed they could confirm this untouched status was through blood. A sheet stained red became a certificate of authenticity. A woman's pain was the contract, and if she didn't bleed, she was called impure, a liar, unfaithful. She could be beaten, abandoned, killed. This myth cost lives. It still does, all for a piece of tissue that means nothing about character, behavior, or choices. And let's talk about how absurd it really is. The hymen can be stretched from things as mundane as bike riding, horseback riding, gymnastics, dance, or even inserting a tampon. Does that mean someone is no longer a virgin? Of course not. Because the presence or absence of a hymen tells you nothing about who a person is or what they've done. But culture didn't care about science. It cared about control. It cared about maintaining power over a woman's body. And the hymen became a symbol, a tool for shame, a weapon of silence. And so the myth was embedded into everything. In education, girls were warned about losing their virginity, as if it was an object, a gift to be given, something you couldn't get back. In media, the moment was dramatized every time. Blood on the sheets, a wince of pain, a quiet tear, the camera panning away as if to say, yes, it hurt. That means it was real. Even in relationships, partners would ask, did it bleed? Are you sure it's your first time? Something feels off. As if a body is a blueprint, as if human anatomy is identical across all people, as if sex is something that leaves visible, measurable proof. But let's be clear, there is no universal first-time experience. There is no single sign. There is no tissue that holds your worth. You are not defined by what does or doesn't happen inside your body. You are not less if you didn't bleed. You are not broken if you did. You are not a statistic, a symbol, or a story someone else gets to write. And if you still carry the shame, if you still remember that moment with confusion or guilt, understand this. It wasn't your fault. You were never supposed to carry that burden. The myth was placed on your shoulders long before you were old enough to question it. But now you can. Now we all can. We can start teaching truth instead of tradition. We can start telling people what the hymen really is. Just tissue, nothing more. We can stop measuring worth with blood and stop tying pain to proof. The hymen is not a sacred seal. It's not a gateway. It's not a moral boundary. It's just part of a body. And no one gets to decide your story based on what they think it should do. Because the truth, your body doesn't owe anyone pain. And it never did. 2. What really causes pain? They told you it would hurt. They made it sound inevitable, like pain was stitched into your body, like suffering was part of the design. But the truth is more human than that. The truth is quieter, easier to miss, because it doesn't shout like myths do. But if you listen closely, it's always been there. Pain during first-time sex isn't automatic. It's not a biological law. It's not written in stone, but it does happen. And when it does, there are reasons. Real reasons. Understandable reasons. Reasons that can be addressed, softened, healed. The first is fear. Not the kind that makes you scream, but the kind that makes you freeze. The kind that lives in your shoulders, in your jaw, in the tightness of your breath. When we're afraid, our bodies don't open. They brace. They tense. They lock down. Fear is the body's way of saying, not yet. I'm not ready. Something feels unsafe. And yet, how many people go into their first experience with fear tangled around their ribcage? Fear of doing it wrong. Fear of being judged. Fear of being hurt. Fear of bleeding. Fear of being changed forever. They've been told it will hurt, so they enter the moment already shrinking from it. Their body doesn't know what to expect, only that it must defend itself. Muscles tighten. Lubrication shuts down. The heart races, and the mind begins to spiral. What should have been soft becomes strained. What could have been gentle becomes forceful, not because of bad intentions, but because no one taught anyone differently. Now imagine this. You walk into an experience that's supposed to be intimate, connected, personal, and instead, you're holding your breath. You're trying to get it over with. You've been told that it's a milestone, something you just have to endure. So you clench, you rush, you ignore your discomfort because the world told you to expect it. That is not how your body wants to be met. That is not how trust is built. That is not how pleasure begins. So yes, fear causes pain. Not because your body is broken, but because it's protecting you. The second reason is lack of preparation, not just emotionally, but physically. When the body is aroused, it prepares itself. The vaginal walls expand, lubrication flows. The body says, yes, I'm ready for this. But when you're nervous, unsure, rushed, those signals don't come, and so friction replaces flow. Friction causes discomfort. Dryness leads to tearing. And again, pain enters, not as a punishment, but as a consequence of ignoring the body's timing. No one teaches this. Not in school, not in homes where sex is taboo, not in places where silence is seen as protection. So many people have no idea that foreplay isn't optional, it's foundational. That emotional safety isn't a bonus, it's the base. That comfort is the first ingredient in physical intimacy, not the last. But how would they know? They're told that virginity is something to be lost, not something to step into with intention, that the goal is to get it over with. So they do. Fast, anxiously, without asking, without checking in, and afterward they wonder what went wrong. They wonder why it hurt so badly, why they didn't feel the connection people spoke about. The truth is, what causes pain is not the presence of sex. It's the absence of care, the absence of slowness, the absence of choice, the absence of education. But sometimes pain also comes from pressure, the emotional kind. Pressure to say yes, pressure to not seem inexperienced, pressure to please someone else, pressure to finally get it over with because everyone else already has. That pressure doesn't sound like screaming. It sounds like a quiet, persistent voice in your head saying, just do it. Don't make it awkward. Don't ruin the moment. And so, people move forward without really being ready. Their body says no, but their mouth says yes. And that disconnect is where pain finds its doorway. And yes, in rare cases, pain can come from a medical issue. Vaginismus, for example, a condition where the vaginal muscles involuntarily contract in response to penetration. Pelvic floor tension. Infections. Trauma. These are real and valid reasons. But too often people are misdiagnosed as just anxious when their pain is medical. Or worse, they're told pain is normal and to just push through it. But pushing through pain never makes it better. It makes it worse. It teaches your body that intimacy is something to fear, that your discomfort doesn't matter, that your boundaries are too loud. And that is a lesson no one should ever be forced to learn. So what really causes pain? It's not the act. It's not the presence of a partner. It's not your body failing you. It's what wasn't said, what wasn't taught, what wasn't honored. Pain happens when we treat the body like an object to be used, rather than a language to be understood. When we treat the first time as a finish line to cross, rather than a doorway to walk through together. When we let myths write the script instead of allowing real people to write their own. But now we know. We know fear tenses the body. We know pressure silences consent. We know lack of education leads to confusion. We know that first-time pain is not a fact. It's a reflection of what we haven't been taught. And knowledge changes everything. Because when you understand what causes pain, you can begin to prevent it. You can slow down. You can listen. You can wait. You can ask. You can breathe. Because pain should never be part of the plan. And if it is, stop, pause, talk, care. Because your body is not a battleground. It's not something to be conquered. It's something to be respected. Every time. Especially the first time. Fear in the body, how tension creates pain. It begins long before the moment itself, long before any touch, long before the lights dim or the breath quickens. It begins in the mind, in the things we were told or weren't told, in the silences that echoed louder than words, in the way sex was presented to us, not as a conversation, but as a warning. Fear doesn't announce itself. It doesn't always scream. It doesn't always come with panic or alarm. Sometimes fear wears silence. Sometimes it looks like uncertainty. Sometimes it sounds like a nervous laugh when you're unsure what to expect, but too afraid to ask. And when that fear isn't met with reassurance, when it's not soothed, not acknowledged, not addressed, it doesn't disappear. It moves inward. It settles inside the body like a clenched fist, and it stays there, waiting. So when the moment finally arrives, when two people stand on the edge of intimacy for the very first time, what lives in the body begins to speak. Not with words, but with tension, with resistance, with hesitation wrapped in skin. Fear doesn't just live in the mind. It lives in the pelvic floor, in the jaw, in the shoulders that stay raised just a little too high, in the way the legs press together involuntarily, instinctively. The body knows when something feels unsafe, and it prepares, not for pleasure, but for survival. So what does the body do when it's afraid? It tightens, muscles contract, the vaginal canal narrows. Lubrication slows down, the breath shortens, and suddenly, everything that should be soft feels like pressure. Everything that should be welcome feels like intrusion. And yet so many people walk into that moment without realizing what's happening. They mistake the tension for inexperience. They think, this is just how it's supposed to be. They push through, they hold their breath, they grit their teeth, and the pain arrives. Not because something is wrong with their body, but because they weren't given the space to feel safe. Fear turns a trusting body into a battlefield. Not because the partner is cruel, not because the act is violent, but because the nervous system is sending alarms. Alarms that say, I'm not ready, I'm unsure, I need more time. But those alarms are often ignored because no one taught us how to listen for them. Because first-time sex is framed as something you just get through, not something you move through with care. Fear can be subtle. It can hide behind anticipation, behind the pressure to finally do it, behind the weight of someone else's expectations. And once it's in the room, it doesn't just affect the physical. It steals presence. It replaces curiosity with performance. It replaces excitement with anxiety. And when fear leads, the body follows. Not in surrender, but in retreat. Not in openness, but in armor. We don't talk enough about how trauma and stress are stored in the body. We think of fear as something fleeting, something in the mind. But the body remembers. It remembers every time it was touched without consent, every time it was looked at with judgment, every time it felt shame or pressure or the weight of someone else's desire. All of that memory lives in the muscles. And when those memories are activated, the body protects itself. Now imagine a young woman, lying still, unsure, afraid to speak, afraid that saying wait will ruin the moment, afraid that pausing will disappoint her partner. She wants to be wanted. She wants to be accepted. So she ignores the tension. She lets it happen. And the pain confirms everything she feared. She thinks, this must be normal. This must be how it's supposed to feel. But it's not. It never was. And now imagine the other side, a young man, equally inexperienced. He's nervous too, but he's been taught to perform, to make it happen. He's heard the same myths, that it's supposed to hurt, that it's part of the process. So when she tenses, when her body tightens, he doesn't pause. Not because he doesn't care, but because no one ever taught him how to read the signs. No one told him that silence isn't always consent, that stillness can mean fear. And so both walk away from the moment with confusion. One feels shame for feeling pain, the other feels guilt for not knowing how to stop it. Both were victims of a myth. Both were shaped by silence. But this pain wasn't inevitable. It was preventable. If only someone had said, it's okay to be nervous. It's okay to take your time. It's okay to stop. It's okay to not be ready. If only they'd been told that the body needs safety to open. That pleasure requires permission, not just from another person, but from yourself. The nervous system needs calm. The body needs trust. Trust in the partner. Trust in the moment. Trust in the idea that if something doesn't feel right, you can speak and you will be heard. That kind of trust is what opens the body. That's what melts the tension. That's what allows sex, especially the first time, to become something meaningful, not painful. Because fear is not a flaw, it's a signal, a sacred one. And when we learn to listen to it, we begin to rewrite the script. We learn that the body isn't a problem to fix, it's a message to understand. And that understanding is where healing begins. Lack of communication and emotional readiness. They say the body knows, but what they forget to mention is the heart knows too. And when the heart is unsure, the body will follow. You can't force comfort, you can't manufacture trust, and you can't fake readiness. We often talk about first-time sex like it's just physical. 2 bodies, 1 act, something to tick off a list, something inevitable. But no one tells you the truth, that without communication, without emotional readiness, even the gentlest touch can feel like a weight. Even the softest moment can leave a scar. The silence between 2 people is louder than it seems. When there are no words, no check-ins, no, are you okay? The body doesn't feel chosen. It feels trapped. It doesn't open. It closes. It braces. And from that silence, pain is born. Not always physical, but lasting all the same. We've been conditioned to believe that sex is intuitive, that we're just supposed to know what to do, that somehow magically we'll read each other's minds. But real intimacy isn't built on guesses. It's built on words, on softness, on safety. Without communication, assumptions take over. He assumes she's ready because she didn't say no. She assumes she can't say no because the moment's already begun. Neither one knows what the other is thinking. And in that silence, consent becomes cloudy. Desire becomes muted. And pain walks in, not with cruelty, but with confusion. Because how can you say, "I'm not ready," when no one ever told you you were allowed to? How can you express discomfort when you were never taught the language for it? How do you pause a moment that feels like a movie scene you're expected to complete? In the absence of emotional readiness, the act becomes mechanical. It stops being an experience and becomes a performance. And when you're performing, you're not feeling. You're just trying to get through it, to do it right, to not ruin it, to not disappoint. That pressure weighs heavy, especially during the first time. You want it to be perfect. You want it to be special. But you don't know how to say, "This feels fast." You don't know how to ask for what you need. And sometimes you don't even know what you need yet. That's why emotional readiness matters. Because readiness isn't about age. It's not about being in a relationship. It's not about how many times you've thought about it. Readiness is a feeling, a calm knowing inside you that says, "I am safe. I am respected. I have a voice, and that voice will be heard." When you are emotionally ready, your body responds. Your mind is present. Your heart is open. You can express your needs. You can say no without fear. You can say yes without pressure. But without that readiness, without that emotional grounding, you're more likely to ignore discomfort, more likely to push yourself too far, more likely to internalize the pain and assume it was your fault. And that kind of pain doesn't just live in your body, it stays in your spirit. It colors the way you approach intimacy forever. And yet, we're not taught to wait for emotional readiness. We're told to watch the clock, to compare ourselves to our peers, to keep up, to not be behind. So people rush, they confuse pressure with desire, they confuse silence with consent, and they confuse sex with connection, even when it feels hollow. So many people leave their first sexual experience not feeling empowered, but confused. Not because they didn't care about their partner, not because they didn't want it to be special, but because no one ever told them that communication is everything, that checking in isn't awkward, it's essential, that you can stop, you can slow down, you can ask, "Are you okay?" and mean it. And that kind of honesty doesn't kill the mood, it builds trust. Real intimacy doesn't begin with touching bodies. It begins with touching truths, with two people sharing vulnerability before sharing skin, with both asking, "Are you ready?" and both answering with clarity, not confusion. You can't read someone's mind. You can't feel someone's fear unless they speak it. But if you've created a space where they feel safe, they will speak. And that moment, that trembling truth between two people, that's where the pain ends and the connection begins. So what causes pain during first-time sex? Often, it's not what happens physically. It's what wasn't said. It's what was assumed. It's the weight of performing instead of the freedom to be. It's the lack of emotional presence, the absence of mutual understanding. But the moment we bring communication into the space, everything changes. The pressure dissolves, the guessing stops, and the body, now free of fear, begins to relax, begins to trust, begins to open. Because love doesn't live in silence, and consent isn't the absence of a no. It's the presence of a full-hearted, whole-bodied yes. One that's spoken out loud, one that's chosen without pressure, one that's rooted in emotional readiness. No one should be afraid to speak, to ask, to pause, to be unsure. These are not signs of weakness, they're signs of respect. For your body, for your heart, for the person you're sharing them with. You don't need to know everything.